Hello everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at Metaphysical Disputation 28 from Francisco Suarez on the first division of being into the absolutely infinite and the finite, and other divisions which equate to this. And today we are on section 2, whether being is sufficiently and adequately divided into the members finite and infinite, and other equivalent members. First, the objections. What about relative beings? It seems like there are these beings which are neither finite or infinite and are without quantification of perfection. These are relative beings, so think of the members of the Trinity. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are relations of opposition, at least on Suarez's view. You could also have relations between other beings, like a difference in height or a person's self-relation. These don't seem to have any quantity of perfection, so they would not fall under infinite and finite. Another problem would be that uncreated and created beings do not express a true dichotomy. You have these things which are neither created nor uncreated. These would be the divine relations, again, so the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Christ, because Christ is not a created being, but he also doesn't necessarily require his human nature, so he's neither created nor uncreated. And modes, which are the aspects of a thing or the accidents of a thing which are inseparable without the destruction of the mode. For example, the temperature of a cup of coffee is not necessarily part of the coffee, and the temperature can't exist without the coffee, but the coffee can exist without the temperature. Then the other objection is that necessary and contingent are not a true dichotomy, so you can have things which are neither necessary nor contingent. And the example here is God's act of willing the world. So God creates the world, God wills for the world to exist. However, the world didn't have to exist, and God didn't need to create the world. So from God's perspective, there's this thing in him which is directed towards something which is contingent. However, everything about God is necessary. So we've got this issue of, like, how is there contingency in the world if God's act of willing is necessary? And there are people who are saying that there's this act of willing which is neither necessary nor contingent. Then we canvass the various views. There are two here. One is Scotus's, one is a guy named Lychetus view. Scotus's view is that being is divided into quantified and non-quantified, and then quantified being is divided into infinite and finite. So he'll be putting relations into non-quantified being, and quantified being will include everything which is infinite and finite, basically everything other than relations. Lychetus' view is that there's quantified and non-quantified being as well, and then quantified being is separated into beings which are perfect with no imperfection, which is God, perfect with some imperfection, which is normal beings, beings with no perfection but could imply imperfection, which are relations, and then non-quantified being, which is no perfections and no imperfections. It's unclear what falls into this category. No examples are given. Suarez has a refutation of Lychetus here. The first is that number 3 was a contradiction, that is, a being with no perfection that is quantified, because quantity necessarily involves some level of perfection, and he also says that no being is capable of having no perfection and no imperfection, because to have no perfection and no imperfection in any way would just be nothing. And then also, finally, no being is capable of having imperfection without at least being capable of having some perfection, which goes against the idea he has here of relations. Because to have an imperfection is to lack a perfection that you are ordered towards. But if relations are incapable of perfection, that means there's no imperfection to have because there's no perfection that they could lack. Then we have the resolution of the question. Quantified being is apt to be infinite and finite, and all being is quantified by its amount of essential or formal perfection. So we have these different beings. They all have this level of perfection. Some beings are more perfect than others, either by reason of their fulfillment of their end or by reason of being a better kind of being. So if you think of a human is better than a rock. There's more moral worth to a human than to a rock. But then if you look at between different humans, maybe you have like one human who's committed a bunch of heinous crimes and another person who has always tried to live the best life they can. The person who lives the best life they can has more formal perfection than the human who is committing a bunch of heinous crimes. So they're both better than the rock. However, the human who's also morally good is containing more perfection in that sense than the other human. Then we have the resolutions to the objections. The first is that created relations are finite and uncreated relations include the divine essence, so they are infinite. The uncreated relations are ideas we have about the divine essence, but they're what Suarez calls their objective concept is identical to the divine essence. So we have the formal concept, which is our idea of the thing, and then the objective concept is the object in the world that our idea is about. So the objective concept is identical to the divine essence, regardless of how distinct our formal concept of the divine relations are. And as identical to the divine essence, it is infinite like the divine essence. Then we have the resolution to objection 2. The divine relations are uncreated, and Christ is also uncreated, even though his human nature was created. So Christ, as a being, was infinite, or is infinite and eternal, incapable of being affected in his divinity, but he has a nature which he possesses, which is created. So Christ is uncreated, however, when considered simply as a human nature, he is created. And then finally, modes are finite and created, so he's responded to all of the supports for one of the premises in the second objection here. These are either infinite or finite. None of them fall in some weird in-between area. Then on the idea of God's will. So remember, God's will is something which is necessary. It's in him, and as such, it's identical to his simplicity. God has this act of willing the world. Well, the world isn't necessary, so God's will here is causing the world to exist contingently in some way. So we have this object which is supposedly neither necessary nor contingent that's in God. Suarez objects, and he says that God's will is necessary and simple. God has one act of willing, but the effects of God's will are not necessary nor simple. It's indeterministic. There are multiple possible outcomes to God taking his one act of willing. So when God necessarily wills himself and wills the world, the effects of his willing, at least on the side of creation, are contingent rather than necessary. I hope you learned something.